The silence was the most expensive thing I owned. It wasn't the sterile, dead quiet of a soundproofed room, but the living, breathing silence of a house too large for one person. It was the whisper of the wind through the tall Douglas firs that ringed my property, the distant sigh of the Puget Sound, the gentle hum of a climate control system I didn't understand but had paid a fortune for. It was the silence of success, a profound and hollow stillness that had cost me my youth, my sleep, and every ounce of my focus for the past decade. My name is Alex. Or rather, the name on my birth certificate, the one I'd never seen, was likely something else entirely. Alex was the name given to me by Sarah and Tom Miller, the couple who found me. Not in a hospital bassinet, but on the cold, concrete step of Fire Station 12, wrapped in a thin, gray blanket and a mother's desperation. The only thing I had from my other life, my first life, was a small silver locket, tarnished with age, empty on the inside. 30 years later, I was sitting in the leather Eames chair in the middle of my cavernous living room, staring out at the watercolor sunset bleeding across the sky. The glass wall in front of me was probably worth more than the house I grew up in. 2 weeks ago, I had finalized the sale of my software company, Nexus Solutions, to a global tech conglomerate. The number that appeared in my bank account had so many zeros it looked like a typo. I was, by every conceivable metric, a self-made millionaire. Poster boy for the American dream. The abandoned baby who built an empire from code and caffeine. But the silence in my new, architecturally stunning house didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an echo chamber, amplifying the one question that had haunted my entire existence. Why? My phone buzzed on the glass coffee table, pulling me from my reverie. It was a picture message from Mom Sarah. It was a selfie of her and Dad Tom grinning widely. Dad had a smear of sawdust on his cheek, and Mom's hair was a little wild, like she'd just come in from the garden. The caption read, "Your father finally finished the new birdhouse. We're celebrating with his famous lasagna. Come over. We miss your face." A genuine smile. That was my family. Not a DNA match, not a bloodline, but a choice. A choice they made 30 years ago, and a choice I made every single day. On my way, I texted back, grabbing my keys. The drive from my secluded waterfront property to their modest suburban home in Bellevue was a journey through my own history. I left the world of polished chrome and minimalist design and entered a world of worn-out welcome mats, blooming rose bushes, and the comforting scent of a life well lived. Their house wasn't big, but it was full. Full of photo albums, handmade quilts, Dad's woodworking projects, and the lingering smell of Mom's baking. It was full of love. I let myself in, calling out, "I'm here for the famous lasagna. I hope it's better than the last famous chili." Mom emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a small woman with kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled, which was often. She wrapped me in a hug that smelled of garlic and tomato sauce. "Oh, hush. His chili is a work in progress," she said, her voice warm as a summer afternoon. "But the lasagna is a masterpiece. How are you, sweetie? Is that big, empty house treating you okay?" "It's quiet," I said, which was the most honest answer I could give. Dad came in from his workshop in the garage, a solid, gentle giant of a man whose calloused hands had taught me how to ride a bike, tie a Windsor knot, and fix a leaky faucet. He clapped me on the shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Quiet is good for thinking," he said, his voice a low, rumbling bass. "But a man can't live on thoughts alone. Good thing you're here." Sarah made enough to feed an army. Dinner was a loud, cheerful affair at their small kitchen table. They didn't ask about the money, not directly. They never did. They asked if I was eating right, if I was getting enough sleep, if I was happy. They were proud, I knew that, but not of the millions. They were proud of the boy who used to take apart their toasters to see how they worked, the teenager who spent his weekends learning to code in their dusty basement, the man who had worked relentlessly to build something meaningful. "You know," Dad said, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied sigh, "I was looking at that old shed in the backyard, the one where you set up your first office with that clunky old desktop." He chuckled. The roof's starting to leak. I was thinking of tearing it down. Don't you dare, I said, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. That's a historical landmark. That's where Nexus Solutions was born. He's right, Tom, Mom chimed in. That shed saw more late nights than a hospital intern. Remember when he'd forget to eat and I'd have to bring him sandwiches and a glass of milk? We laughed, and for a little while I wasn't a tech mogul. I was just Alex, their son, sitting at their kitchen table, enveloped in the unconditional love that had been the one constant in my life. You know, you could buy 1,000 sheds now, Dad said, his expression turning more serious. You could buy anything you want. We just want to make sure you're buying things that make you happy, son. You too make me happy, I said, and the truth of it was so powerful it almost made my voice crack. And I want you to be happy. Please let me help with things. A new roof, a new car, anything. It was a conversation we'd had before. Mom patted my hand. Alex, we are so incredibly proud of you, but we have everything we need. Your father's pension is solid. My garden is thriving, and our son is healthy and safe. That's all we've ever wanted. Their humility was both a comfort and a quiet source of pain. They had given me everything, had asked for nothing in return, and continued to ask for nothing, even now when I could give them the world. It was a stark contrast to the ghost parents who had given me nothing and, in doing so, had taken a piece of my identity with them. After I helped with the dishes, I hugged them both goodbye. As I stood on their porch, under the dim yellow light, Mom held my arm for a moment longer. You know, she said softly, with all your new resources, have you ever thought about looking for them? She didn't need to specify who them were. The word hung in the cool night air between us. Of course I had. The thought was a permanent resident in the back of my mind. In my darker moments, I imagined them as cruel, heartless monsters who had discarded me like trash. In my more charitable moments, I imagined them as terrified teenagers, caught in an impossible situation, making the hardest choice of their lives, hoping I'd find a better one. I've thought about it, I admitted. I'm not sure what I'd be looking for, or what I'd do if I found it. Whatever you decide, we're here for you, she said, giving my arm a final squeeze. You are our son. Nothing will ever change that. I drove back to my silent, magnificent house under a canopy of stars. Mom's question had unlocked the box I usually kept sealed tight. I went to my home office, a room that overlooked the dark, churning water of the Sound. I didn't turn on the main lights, just a small desk lamp that cast a pool of gold on the polished mahogany. From a locked drawer, I took out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay the tarnished silver locket. It was heart-shaped, intricately engraved with vines and tiny flowers. It was smooth and cool to the touch. I'd spent countless hours as a child tracing its patterns, trying to imagine the woman who had worn it. Was her hair dark like mine? Did she have my eyes? Did her heart break when she placed this around my neck and walked away? The locket was a dead end.
No markings, no initials.
The police had found nothing. The firemen at Station 12 remembered nothing but a bundle and a cry in the pre-dawn chill. I was a ghost, a story with no beginning. With my newfound wealth came a new, terrifying power. I could hire the best private investigators in the world. I could unearth secrets buried for 30 years. I could, potentially, find the people who created me. But what then? Would I find peace or just more pain? Would I find a loving, regretful couple or a pair of opportunists who would see me not as a son, but as a winning lottery ticket? I put the locket back in its box and stared out at the water. For the first time, I seriously considered it. Maybe it was time. Maybe knowing, no matter how painful, was better than the suffocating silence of not knowing. Maybe I needed to find the first page of my story before I could truly start writing the next chapter. The next few days passed in a blur of unfamiliar leisure. I tried to relax. I bought a kayak and paddled it out onto the Sound, feeling the cold spray on my face. I read novels instead of market analyses. I tried to teach myself how to cook something other than instant noodles. But the restlessness remained, a low hum of anxiety beneath the surface. The question of my origins, reignited by my mom, refused to be silenced again. I spent an afternoon researching private investigation firms that specialized in finding birth families. I bookmarked 3 of the most reputable ones, my finger hovering over the Contact Us button for hours. Felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. It was a Tuesday morning, a little over a week after my dinner with my parents, when my world tilted on its axis. I was in my home gym, a space I'd insisted on during the house design, trying to sweat out my anxiety on the treadmill. I was listening to a podcast about astrophysics, letting the concepts of cosmic distance and deep time put my own small problems into perspective. The digital doorbell chimed, its melodic tone cutting through the podcast. A video feed popped up on the large screen in front of me. I didn't recognize the car parked in my driveway, an old, slightly battered domestic sedan, a decade old at least, with a fading paint job. It looked utterly out of place against the modern, angular lines of my home. A man and a woman were standing on my doorstep. They looked to be in their late 50s. The man was thin, with a nervous energy about him. He had thinning, sandy hair and wore a cheap-looking polo shirt that was a size too big. The woman was gaunter, her face a roadmap of hard lines and worry. She clutched her handbag to her chest like a shield. They both looked lost, and vaguely familiar in a way I couldn't place. Maybe they were lost tourists, or perhaps selling something door to door, though my long, private driveway usually discouraged that. I slowed the treadmill to a walk, my heart rate still elevated, but now for a different reason. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. I hit the intercom button. "Can I help you?" My voice echoed through the external speaker. The couple flinched, startled by the disembodied sound. The man stepped forward, clearing his throat. Yes, we're looking for someone." "Alex Miller?" he asked, his voice raspy. "You've found him. Who's asking?" The man and woman exchanged a look, a silent, weighty conversation passing between them in a split second. The woman gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The man took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the camera lens as if he could see me through it. "My name is Richard. This is Brenda," he said, his voice trembling slightly. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. The next words he spoke seemed to drain all the oxygen from the room, from my lungs, from the entire world. "We think we believe, Alex. We're your parents." For a long moment, the world dissolved into white noise. The hum of the treadmill, the voice in my earbuds discussing black holes, the gentle thud of my running shoes on the belt, it all vanished, replaced by the rushing sound of blood in my ears. The 2 faces on the screen stared out, pixelated and yet painfully real. Richard and Brenda. They said they were my parents. The word, so loaded, so foreign in this context, hung in the air of my sterile gym like a poison gas. My first instinct was a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated cynicism. Of course, they showed up now. Not 30 years ago, not 20, not even 1. They showed up the moment my name was no longer just a name, but a brand, a headline in the financial section, a synonym for a 9-figure windfall. The timing wasn't just suspicious. It was a confession. But beneath the cynicism was a deeper, colder current. A 30-year-old wound that had never properly healed. The little boy on the fire station steps, the one who stared at his own reflection wondering where his nose or his chin came from, was still inside me. He whispered, "What if?" My thumb trembled as I pressed the intercom button again. My voice came out strained, a stranger's voice. "Stay there. I'm coming to the door." I turned off the treadmill, my legs feeling unsteady. I grabbed a towel, wiped the sweat from my face and neck, and pulled on a plain gray t-shirt. Every movement was deliberate, slow, as if I were moving through water. I was buying time, trying to reassemble the shattered pieces of my composure. As I walked through the long, sun-drenched hallway, the silence of my house, once a symbol of peace, now felt like the held breath before a verdict. My home, my fortress, was about to be breached. I stood before the large, solid oak door, my hand hovering over the handle. I could see them on the security monitor, shifting their weight, Brenda whispering something to Richard, who just nodded, his gaze fixed on the door. They looked like supplicants at the gate of a king, and the thought made me sick to my stomach. This wasn't a reunion. It was an audience. Taking one last, fortifying breath, I opened the door. Up close, they were even more worn than on the screen. Richard had the sallow, tired skin of a man who hadn't seen a vacation in decades. His eyes, a watery blue, darted around, taking in the high ceilings, the floor-to-ceiling glass, the sprawling view of the sound. He looked like he was trying to calculate the value of the air I was breathing. Brenda was the one who held my gaze. Her eyes were a deep, dark brown just like mine. Seeing my own eyes staring back at me from a stranger's face was a physical jolt, like touching a live wire. Her face was a latticework of fine lines, etched by worry or regret, or maybe just a hard life. She clutched her worn leather purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "Alex," she breathed, her voice raspy with emotion. It might have been genuine. It might have been a performance. Couldn't tell. "You'd better come in," I said, my tone flat and devoid of the welcome it should have held. I stepped back, holding the door open. They shuffled inside, their worn-out sneakers looking comically out of place on the polished concrete floors. They moved with a hesitant reverence, as if they were in a museum. I led them into the main living area, the one with the panoramic view that usually brought me a sense of calm. Today it just felt like a stage, and we were the unwilling actors in a tragedy I hadn't auditioned for. I gestured to a sprawling, minimalist sofa that cost more than their car. "Please sit." They perched on the edge of the cushion, refusing to lean back, as if afraid they might soil the expensive fabric. I remained standing, towering over them. It was a power move, and I knew it, but I needed every advantage I could get. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "This is some place you've got here, son. We saw in the papers about your company. We're so proud." The word son hit me like a slap. He had no right to it. And the mention of the money, so early in the conversation, confirmed my worst fears. They hadn't come for me. They had come for what I had. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "You made an extraordinary claim at my door. You have my full, undivided attention. Please explain." Brenda flinched at my tone, but Richard seemed to steel himself. This was his moment. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, adopting a posture of earnest sincerity. "We were kids, Alex. Just kids. I was 19, Brenda was 17. Her parents, they were good people but strict. So religious. If they'd found out she was pregnant," he shook his head, looking down at his hands, "they would have thrown her out. We had nothing. No money, no education, no future. We were terrified." Brenda picked up the narrative, her voice trembling. "We talked about what to do for months. Every option seemed impossible. We loved you. I want you to know that. We loved you so much. But we couldn't give you anything. We were living in a friend's basement. Richard was working odd jobs, cash under the table. I was trying to finish high school without anyone knowing." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a treacherous second, I felt a pang of something akin to sympathy. This was the story I had sometimes imagined, the one where they were tragic figures, not monsters. "Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done," she continued, a single tear tracing a path through her makeup. "It felt like ripping my own heart out. We chose the fire station because we knew you'd be found quickly. We knew you'd be safe. We hoped, we prayed that you'd find a good family. A family that could give you everything we couldn't." She looked around the vast, empty room. "And it looks like our prayers were answered. You've done so well for yourself." The story was seamless, plausible. It was perfectly constructed to elicit pity and understanding. But it was the ending that soured it all. It wasn't about my well-being. It was about my wealth. I crossed my arms, my face unreadable. A compelling story, but it's just theta story. How do I know any of it is true? This was the moment of truth. Brenda's hand went to her purse. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers shaking, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a photocopy, old and faded. She handed it to me. It was a birth certificate. For a baby boy, unnamed, born 30 years ago at a small clinic on the outskirts of Tacoma. The mother's name was listed as Brenda Mae Hoskins, age 17. The father was Richard James Peterson, age 19. My stomach clenched. It was possible. That's not enough, I said, my voice a low growl. Brenda looked at me, her brown eyes pleading. There was something else. I left it with you, tucked inside your blanket. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It was a locket. My grandmother's locket. Silver. Heart-shaped. It had little vines and tiny flowers engraved on the front. It was empty on the inside. I put it around your neck myself. Do you still have it? The air left my lungs in a rush. The locket. The one tangible piece of my past. The object I had obsessed over. The silent testament to a mother I never knew. It sat in a locked drawer in my office. A sacred relic. And she had just described it. Perfectly. I felt dizzy. My carefully constructed walls of skepticism crumbling to dust. It was true. These two broken people, sitting awkwardly on my designer sofa, were the architects of my existence. They were the answer to the question that had defined me. And I felt nothing. No joy. No sense of completion. Just a vast, hollow emptiness, followed by a slow-burning rage. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had abandoned me with this symbol. This token of love that was, in the end, just a key they hoped to one day use to unlock my bank account. I didn't tell them I had it. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I just stared at Brenda, my expression hardening into a mask of stone. So you left me? I said, the words tasting like ash. And for 30 years, nothing. No calls, no letters, no attempts to find me. You didn't know if I was happy. You didn't know if I was healthy. You didn't even know if I was alive. But you read an article in a business journal. And suddenly, your long-lost parental instincts kick in. Richard bristled, his feigned sincerity cracking. Now hold on. That's not fair. We thought about you every day. Every single day. We tried to look a few years later, but the records were sealed. What were we supposed to do? We were just simple people. You were supposed to try harder. I shot back, my voice rising. You were supposed to act like parents. We're acting like parents now, he insisted, his voice growing louder, more desperate. He stood up, taking a step towards me. We're here now, aren't we? We want to be in your life. We want to be a family. A family? I repeated the word, tasting its bitter irony. What does that mean to you, Richard? Does it mean getting to know the son you threw away? Or does it mean getting a piece of what he built without you? The truth, ugly and raw, was finally on the table. Brenda started to sob quietly, burying her face in her hands. It was a good performance, but I wasn't buying it anymore. Richard's face flushed with anger and indignation. We're your flesh and blood, he said, his voice cracking with a mix of desperation and entitlement. We gave you life, and we've had it hard, Alex. Real hard. I hurt my back a few years ago. Can't do construction no more. Brenda's been cleaning offices at night just to make ends meet. We have medical bills piled so high. He gestured around the room, at the art on the walls, at the view of the ocean. You have all of this. More than any one person could ever need. We're not asking for a handout. We're asking for your help. For a little bit of help. It's the least you could do for your own mother and father. There it was. The demand wrapped in a pathetic plea. The invoice for my own birth. The price of the silver locket. A cold, terrifying calm descended over me. The rage receded, replaced by an icy clarity. The hurt little boy was gone. In his place stood the man who had built Nexus Solutions from nothing, the man who had stared down venture capitalists and negotiated multi-million-dollar deals. This was just another negotiation, and I knew exactly what my position was. I've heard your story, I said, my voice steady and measured. I walked over to the front door and opened it. The cool sea breeze flowed in, clearing the stale air of their performance. Thank you for sharing it with me. I need time to process this information. Richard and Brenda stared at me, dumbfounded. This wasn't the reaction they had prepared for. They had expected tears, or anger followed by guilt-ridden acceptance. They hadn't expected a dismissal. Process? What's there to process? Richard stammered. We're your parents. We need help now. You have waited 30 years, I said, looking him directly in the eye. You can wait a little longer. I have your names. If I decide I wish to speak with you again, I will find you. Now, please leave. My tone was final. It was the voice I used to end board meetings. There was no room for argument. Brenda looked up at me, her face a mask of disbelief and desperation. Alex, please. Goodbye, Brenda, I said, the name feeling strange on my tongue. Defeated, they walked towards the door. Richard shot me a look of pure venom, the mask of the loving father completely gone, replaced by the bitter sneer of a failed con man. Brenda wouldn't look at me at all. I watched them walk down my long driveway to their battered sedan. They got in, and for a moment they just sat there, likely arguing, their gestures sharp and angry even from a distance. Then, the car started with a sputtering cough and drove away, a sad, pathetic blot on the pristine landscape of my life. I closed the door, the heavy oak shutting with a solid, definitive thud. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of what might have been and the ugliness of what was. It was the sound of a fantasy dying. I walked slowly back to my office and unlocked the drawer. I took out the velvet box and opened it. The silver locket lay there, gleaming dully in the light. It was no longer a symbol of a mother's tragic love. It was a piece of evidence. A tool. A cold piece of metal they had used to try and pick the lock on my life. My hands were shaking, not from shock anymore, but from a profound, soul-deep anger. I felt violated. They hadn't just come for my money. They had tried to steal my story, to rewrite my past and turn my parents, me real parents, Sarah and Tom, into mere caretakers. They had tried to cheapen the love that had been my foundation, the love that had saved me. I snapped the box shut. I couldn't stand to look at the locket anymore. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the water, my mind a whirlwind. They would be back. Or they would go to the press. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. My carefully ordered world had been thrown into chaos. And in the chaos, only one thing was clear. I wasn't alone in this. I needed my family. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the contacts. I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't call my publicist. I scrolled down to the name that mattered most. My finger pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then a warm, familiar voice answered.
Suatia.
Everything okay? I took a shaky breath, the sound of my mother's voice a lifeline in a raging storm. Mom, I said, my own voice cracking with an emotion I couldn't name. I need you. Can you and Dad, can you come over?